Okay, you know what time it is. It is time to wrap up September reading. I'm going to try and keep it as short and sweet as possible. I actually read a lot more physically this month than I even realized, though of course there were some other formats slipping in there. And I started the month off strong with Knockout by Sarah MacLean. Now, if you watch my Feature Friday, you might be like, where did that paperback come from? Because this is not the format I read this book in. I actually read this in the ebook, which I had pre-ordered. But I loved it so much. It's Tommy and Imogen's story. It's the story we've been waiting 3 books for, and that story delivered, and I have physical copies of the others in the series, and so I went ahead and picked this up at Printers Row Lit Fest from the Love Sweet Arrow booth. Now, there were issues with the first print run of this with the binding and the glue, and I do have some concerns flipping through this. You see kind of right there, there's a little bit of potential loosey-goosiness at the back of this book, so I don't know how readable this copy is going to be. I may need to get another one for the future to revisit this, but I absolutely loved this book, and it surprised me in ways, and Sarah MacLean is always surprising me in ways, but I felt like I knew kind of what the tone of this book was going to be based on how we'd set up Tommy and Imogen in previous books, and that's not exactly what we got, and not in a way where it felt like a bait and switch or it didn't deliver, but in a way that was surprising and kept me as a reader on my toes. So in this book, Imogen and the Bells are investigating a series of explosions that are happening around the city and targeting women-owned businesses, and Tommy just happens to be doing the same thing, but he doesn't like that the Bells are on the tail of this and that it is potentially putting Imogen in danger, and through a bunch of maneuvering, including Imogen's brother wanting to marry her off because he doesn't really know what to do with her at this point, Tommy becomes Imogen's bodyguard of sorts, except not really, because she's always giving him the slip, and there is a lot of banter. We definitely have a hero here who is so far gone for his love interest, but the way that plays out between Tommy and Imogen, because they are so equal within the narrative, is just really delicious. I absolutely loved this book. It had a lot of external plot going along as well. If you've been reading the Belle series, you know that there is a lot of like action and adventure elements to this series, so it's very much an outside instigator kind of series in terms of the conflict for the couple, which I absolutely love. And without spoiling anything, this book handled a lot of nuances, especially with Tommy's role as the head of a detective unit at Scotland Yard, very well, and with a lot of nuance. So I definitely recommend this series. Let's be real, I recommend all Sarah MacLean if you haven't read her yet, and this series just continues to be a real delight. Additionally, the twist at the end of this, because if you kind of follow the patterns of Sarah MacLean's writing, generally the big reveal is left for the last book. And we, and by we I mean me and my friend Kelsey, have been trying to figure out what this Duchess reveal is going to be since book 1, so for literal years now. And we got a little closer in this book because we definitely got a tease of something we weren't expecting, and definitely weren't expecting. Not just like, oh, that was a twist, but like I legitimately was not expecting that particular twist with Duchess. So our big question now is whether Duchess is someone we know in the larger Sarah MacLean universe or not. I will be very, very interested to see what this is going to be, what Duchess's book is going to be. The reveal felt most reminiscent to me, and I have been kind of positing that it will be most reminiscent to the Rules of Scoundrels reveal, just based on that kind of twist that was presented, because with like Bare Knuckle Bastards, which was the most recent series, we definitely knew what we were building toward in that last book. There was so much pining, there was so much history there, but here Duchess is such an enigmatic character, and as close as she is to the rest of the Bells, she is also holding herself at arm's length a little bit. So I'm very excited to see those walls come down in her book. And then I listened to The Neighbor Favor by Christina Forrest, which starts off as an epistolary romance novel where Lily and Nick are trading emails back and forth, getting to know each other. Lily works in the publishing industry, though she really wants to get into children's fiction, and she's not there yet. She is under a not so great boss. And Nick, who to be fair she doesn't know is Nick, is the author of her favorite series about Black elves, and he has been writing under a pseudonym, but they are exchanging these letters back and forth, or emails back and forth I should say, and a good chunk of the beginning of the book are these emails, and then Nick kind of ghosts her when she presents the idea of them meeting up because of a myriad of reasons that are fully explored in the plot. And then by romance rules, they happen to start living in the same building years later, and Lily needs a date to a family wedding, and she's been kind of like dealing with her sisters kind of needling her, and so she ends up getting Nick to agree to help her find a date, but in the process, feelings develop there. Now, Nick knows who she is because there has to be someone in the pair that kind of knows what's going on in order for all of that front work in their relationship development to not completely fall by the wayside, or for it to feel like oddly like cheating in some way. This is definitely a romance for people who like books. It's very much different and very much reminiscent of something like You've Got Mail at the same time. Both characters have impeccable taste in books, so heck, if you just need some book recommendations, go ahead and pick this one up. The pacing did occasionally feel a little lopsided to me, just because we spent so much time at the beginning and kind of establishing this connection, and so then that looms so large over the rest of the book. But I really loved these characters, even with the kind of lie at the heart of this, because at the end of the day, Nick not really disclosing who he is to her right off the bat is a lie of omission. So that was a little uncomfy for me, admittedly, but there were logistics and reasons that he had that made that lie stand. And then it became, how do you broach this topic as things, you know, move further and the lie kind of cements. So a lot of the kind of discord does feel real in that way. It doesn't necessarily feel artificial, but it was just something that was always in the back of my mind as they were interacting, especially for Lily, who within the course of the book doesn't know that this is the same guy. And we do get both of their points of view, which I really appreciate. And lie aside, this definitely felt, at least for me, a little bit more on like the cozier side of romance. So if you're wanting something that has stakes, clearly, but just feels a little bit cozier, this is definitely one to give a try. And then I read The Enchanted Hacienda by J.C. Cervantes, and I am not going to lie to you, I did not like this book. And that's a real bummer because I had such high hopes for this book. It follows Harlow, who is an aspiring writer who breaks off a long-term relationship and flees back to her family's farm in Mexico. And at this Enchanted Hacienda, her family grows magical flowers that help with spells that they sell. Additionally, each woman of the family has some kind of magical power except Harlow. And while she's here, she ends up being kind of wrangled into looking over the business while her mother and aunt take a much needed first-time vacation. But in the process of that, she kind of bungles a spell. There's someone trying to get onto the property and see what's going on, and she meets a guy, Ben, who she starts to develop feelings for. Now, this just fell flat to me in a lot of ways. Characters were flat. The magic, which I was so excited for, especially as it was perfectly primed to be this really lyrical and beautiful magical realism, didn't really make any sense, and the wonder of that was never drawn out. Everything just ended up feeling really flat to me in this, and the writing didn't really elevate anything. Instead, it became really frustrating, and the characters, especially Harlow, became really frustrating. And because I was frustrated by the lack of development, I started to be frustrated by the fact that Harlow wanted to be a writer because it seemed like an easy out, and I just found myself getting a little angry. Additionally, her relationship with Ben was very like insta-love, which is explained in the narrative, but it was so frustrating because it felt very juvenile. There was nothing that kind of deepened it for these characters, and the characters ended up feeling juvenile themselves because of it. And despite the setting I was so excited about, it never felt filled with a life of its own in any way, and the action felt like action for the sake of action rather than action that was really forwarding anything. And so I think that is part of where it became incredibly frustrating for me as a reader, and it was just such a bummer because I was very excited for this book and it just didn't work for me. But not to dwell on that too much, to move on, we have What Stalks Among Us by my friend Sarah Hallowell. This, as you know if you watch the Feature Friday on it, is about two teenagers in Indiana who get stuck in a haunted corn maze. It's so different from her first book while still managing to have a weirdly ethereal ghost girl, which she freely admits on her Twitter. But again, this book really digs into the power of friendship, the power of coming into yourself as a young woman, finding power in your anger in a myriad of ways, and it also intentionally or accidentally becomes an exploration about overcoming trauma. I really loved the form of this. It is a little jarring at first course, if you're not expecting it, because it throws us into the action of the corn maze right away. And so you're left scrambling a little bit at the top because you're like, I don't know these characters yet. But those first few iterations through the corn maze, where they're discovering these dead bodies that look suspiciously like them, allow us to get to know them both better. And we are seeing the narrative through Sadie's point of view, so we're definitely getting to know Sadie the best out of the two friends, but we do, over the course of the book, get to know Logan better, and their friendship and how their friendship is portrayed in this book is so powerful. There is not a romance at the heart of this, and yet their friendship is almost a romance in and of itself, platonically, of course, but I love this idea that through every iteration here, they are always drawn to each other. They are always trying to protect the other and seeking the other out and caring about the other. And that's a strength of friendship that we don't really get to explore in that way too often, and I think it is so important to see reflected here. Additionally, in terms of seeing things reflected, lack of Indiana Beach aside, and yes, I am going to mention that every single time, just because it's basically a bit now. But all that aside, I really did feel like my experience as a teenager in Indiana was really reflected here. There was just a tone and a feeling of growing up in small town Indiana that really resonated here. Additionally, if you like video games, and that's all I'm gonna say, other than you will like this. And if you want me to say more or extrapolate on that, be sure to check out my Feature Friday where I discuss this more in depth. And then I read The Notorious Lord Knightley by Lorraine Heath, which is a second chance romance with a lot of bite to it. There's definitely some tinges of angst here because we do really explore the backstory of what is going on here a lot while still giving permission for that romance in the present. Basically, years ago, Regina and Knightley, who is the heir to a dukedom, were supposed to marry. And she was the illegitimate child of a lord and an actress. And so this really was putting her into a protective place in society and raising her up socially. And instead of getting married, despite this love match at the heart of everything, for all the political benefits, this was a love match between the two. And yet, he jilts her on the day of the wedding and puts it around town that it was her that changed her mind, but everyone basically knows that something else is up based on those power imbalances between the two of them. And so she's heartbroken, runs away to Europe, and is writing like travel pieces. He continues to live his life, makes a bunch of business dealings that are presumably explored more in the other books that are in this series first, because I have not read them, has a group of friends, but this is always kind of looming large. And we find out over the course of the book why that happened, because there was definitely a reason. But at the start of the action of this book, it is many years later, we meet them both on the same night in a gaming hell, so points right off the bat, and there is this scandalous book making its way around society, and people are asking Knightley if he is Lord K, because this book is charting a doomed love affair between a Lord K and a young lady. And there's all kinds of buzz about this book, whether it's going to be banned for being inappropriate, all of these things, but it's also starting all of this gossip. And because of certain reflections in this book, Knightley ends up approaching Regina and being like, hey, did you write this book? Is it about me? And she's like, I don't know what you're talking about, dude. I'm just trying to gamble. Absolutely not. So he's kind of on her tail about this. And meanwhile, she's trying to secure a match with another gentleman because she now has a child that she has to consider and is trying to secure some respectability for because she came back from Europe with this child and she knows what it's like to move about society with illegitimacy. And so she's been hiding her child, her daughter, from society. And so she needs this marriage and she needs it somewhat speedily. So Knightley eventually kind of recognizes the danger she's in despite her being still very upset with him, and they kind of come to an agreement wherein he will help her secure this gentleman. There's things in it for him too, but they've kind of made this arrangement. But because of this, they're thrown back together more often. We get more peeks into their past and we see how the future is going to move based on that past and feelings that rekindle. I was a little concerned at first because so many of the tender feelings and even some of the early physical intimacy in the book was rooted in their past relationship, and it just felt like all of that was going to be colored by this tenor sadness, but we did move out of that. That being said, this romance does move back into the past a lot more than I typically experience in a second chance romance of this nature, which I think is what made it read as a little bit more mature to me. And both of our characters here have very specific filial stakes that are driving their action and that make sense of what they're doing, and also present real barriers to this relationship. So I really appreciated how that was done. I also really appreciated that Regina wasn't your typical debutante in that she was illegitimate. And so there was a much different societal position that she was navigating this world within. And so I thought that the way that that was handled was also super compelling. And then in an exercise in which I reread my least favorite assigned reading from high school, I reread Dandelion Wine by Ray Bradbury, and I regret to inform you that I still just don't care. This was presented to me freshman year as an example of like non-linear, non-Aristotelian plot structure, and I get it, but it takes place over the course of the summer in a small town in Illinois at the end of the 20s, and at the time that I first read it, it just made me feel incredibly stuck. Reading it now, I'm able to look back and recognize some of the reflections of kind of growing up that Bradbury was exploring, this real emphasis on these children and their kind of coming of age over this summer, and the adults that are also in this town and how they're kind of in their sunset years, and watching these two generations kind of interact and dovetail. But at the same time, there were things that just didn't make sense to me in this, and having read the introduction to this edition now, I now know that these stories were kind of brought about. I say stories because they very much did feel like interconnected short stories, or short stories that were written around a similar theme or tone and then kind of patchwork together, but they were basically like a word association writing exercise or a variation of. And so there were these things that seemed like they would take up more breadth of the story, like the fact that there was a serial killer in this town for a good portion of this book. The story is later in the book. Now granted, it's a short book, but I believe it was referenced in an earlier story. And so it just kind of changes the tone of some of what's going on. There are some things that still ring true, especially in terms of small town politics, but despite being able to appreciate certain things a little bit more, having a little bit more of a nostalgia lens in my reading of this go around, which I think you really do need to approach this book, and I definitely didn't have as a freshman, I still wasn't ultimately moved. And also the kind of thematic through line of Dandelion Wine, I think could have been explored even more than it was in the book, oddly enough. Also, you will never catch me drinking Dandelion Wine, so. But then I got to read the new Silvia Moreno Garcia, Silver Nitrate, which takes place in Mexico in the 90s and is following the kind of horror film scene at the time and during the golden age of film and how it was kind of changing. And this book has such an interesting premise and hook to it because it is dealing with occultism and Nazis and their interest in occultism through film and through horror films. And yet the book itself, while still delivering on a lot of Silvia Moreno Garcia's hallmarks for me in terms of setting us in a very specific place, building the place out in a way that feels tangible, and also exploring really intriguing, complex, ultimately flawed characters. The plot itself in this one felt very exposition and dialogue heavy for something especially that has such a propulsive angle to it. Our characters Montserrat and Tristan meet this renowned and fading film director of old horror, and they basically get kind of caught up in this plot that his last film was really an attempt at a spell and some more unsavory characters he was tied to, and then them completing this loop of this spell in this unfinished film and what happens because of that. And again, the character work for Montserrat and Tristan was excellent, but the characters around them and the action around them was a little bit looser. And I really would have liked to see everything built out a little bit more so that the stakes of the after they complete that film become a little bit stronger and feel a little bit more tangible, because there are repercussions to that, and we see characters come into play from the director's past, but we don't really have a connection to those characters outside of the exposition. And because the action is so late in the book, there's not really space and time to develop that out more, or space and time isn't taken to develop it out more, so I don't know. Ultimately, I'm never disappointed by a Silvia Moreno Garcia reading experience, but I also felt like there was more potential to mine here. I will say her releases of the last 3 years, I've enjoyed them all, but it always feels like there's one extra step that she could probably have taken narratively, and I wonder if this pressure to put a book out every year is just kind of robbing us of some of that extra nuance and depth. I don't know. Again, I love Silvia Moreno Garcia, so I absolutely still think this is worth your time. There were just also some additional opportunities I feel could have been taken. And then because I was in a short story mood, I read 19 Claws and a Blackbird by Agustina Bastarrica, which is just another absolute win for my reading life in terms of Argentine literature. This was fabulous. Now, I have not read Tender is the Flesh yet. I know. I don't know how at this point. However, this was such a great introduction to Bastarrica's voice and work because the stories in here were incredibly compelling. They had that darkness to them. There was that danger, but there was also something so incredibly human at the heart of it. It's the best of the best in terms of what I am really drawn to in short stories. The stories are also incredibly succinct. They're short, they get to the point, they don't really leave you with any opportunity to feel bored. Now, I know we are in a kind of environment where attention spans are shortening. It can be incredibly frustrating because of that, and I'm not saying that shorter short stories are better over longer short stories by any means, but I am saying that these short stories are incredibly punchy and entertaining. Now, there is still a lot of darkness to these short stories. There's a lot that's odd, but for me personally, that is a selling point. And the darkness is walking a fine line, right? I think it's so easy to not fully appreciate the nuances and how hard it is to write something that's walking that line. Now, I have not read Tender is the Flesh, like I said. I know that that may be a little bit more extreme, and there are some stories in this collection that are more extreme than others, but there's something that is so incredibly visceral about this collection. There is a blurb on the back from Samantha Schweblin, which is all I really need to know. There's also a blurb from Sue Rainsford, who also writes really interesting, kind of twisted stories like Follow Me to Ground. I obviously checked this collection out of the library, but I am seriously considering buying my own copy so that it can sit figuratively along my Mariana Enriquez in my collection. And if you've been around a second, you know what that means to me. And then finally, I read Witch of Wild Things by Raquel Vasquez Gilliland, which I also did a feature Friday on. And this follows Sage, who is returning to her childhood home with her aunt and younger sister, and she hasn't really come home since the death of her youngest sister, which has driven a wedge primarily between Sage and her remaining sister Sky. Now, all of the women in this family have powers. Sage has an unnatural ability with plants. Sky is able to control the weather, though control is a strong word. More, the weather reflects her extreme feelings, and the sister that they lost had a way with animals. And so the magical realism is definitely here in their powers, but also in the appearance of the ghost of her little sister that Sage can only see through her tears. So because of that, she has been holding in a lot of those messy emotions for many, many years. So despite the cozy cover here and the definite romantic leanings of the plot, this book is also very much about relationships with family, overcoming trauma, learning to advocate for yourself. There is so much history at play in this book. There is so much grief and sadness that these characters are working through. They are learning how to say the unsaid things, and the magic is helping them accomplish all of this and reflecting all of the things that are unsaid. So there's a definite function to everything that's going on. I love magical realism. Despite loving it, I would never proclaim myself an expert on magical realism, but as a reader, I personally find it most impactful in scenarios like this, where it really is about an outgrowth of feelings and the things that can't be said. So in addition to all of that going on, Sage is also reconnected with her high school crush, who she used to chat with on AIM, and he didn't know it was her, but he also broke her heart. And so there's a lot of bitterness and hurt that is lingering there, especially because Sage is just coming out of another, if not heartbreaking, embarrassing scenario that leaves her a little bit raw. But this book is still coming out of Berkeley. There is still a romance at the heart of this, and Sage and Tin really develop their relationship and learn more about the other and themselves along the way, while kind of overcoming the sadness of their past to live in the present. I didn't really want to compare these two books because I believe that both authors deserve to be kind of given their own credit and due. However, in looking at this against The Enchanted Hacienda, which I read earlier in the month, this worked so much better for me with a lot of similar themes. They are not the same book by any means. They are not attempting to be the same book by any means. The plot isn't the same, the conflict isn't the same, the love interest isn't the same, to be clear. However, tonally, they felt in a similar spirit, and this one just ultimately worked better for me in terms of how everything was built out, and I think that the magic within the narrative just felt a little bit more rooted and tied to the emotional truth of the story. So if you only had time for one, I would definitely recommend picking up Witch of Wild Things. So All that being said, that was September reading. Let me know if you read any of these below and what your thoughts were. Let me know if you read anything in September that absolutely blew you away and you think should be on my radar, or maybe I have read before and you want to talk about. But as always, thank you for being here and being interested at all in what I have to say about books. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.